Sometimes the most expensive wedding isn't the one that costs the most money. It's the one that costs someone their heart. Grace Whitmore lowered her eyes as the bridal veil blurred the reflection staring back at her from the floor-to-ceiling mirror. Around her, the dressing suite shimmered with polished marble, crystal chandeliers, and white roses flown in overnight from California, yet none of it made the room feel warm. Every breath felt trapped beneath layers of silk and lace. Outside the closed doors, a string quartet rehearsed the same melody again and again, each note echoing through the luxury country estate like a countdown she wished would stop. Her hands trembled as she gripped the bouquet, delicate white peonies wrapped in ivory ribbon, until a single petal drifted silently onto the hardwood floor. She watched it fall as though it had more freedom than she did. Smile. Her mother had reminded her every 10 minutes since sunrise. People are coming from all over the country to witness this wedding. Cameras will be everywhere. Investors will be watching. Do not embarrass this family. Grace had nodded every time because arguing had never changed anything. She had spent 28 years living inside expectations carefully designed by other people. Today was simply the largest expectation of all. A soft knock interrupted the silence before the door opened without waiting for permission. Eleanor Whitmore entered wearing a perfectly tailored cream-colored suit, every strand of silver hair in place, every movement calm and deliberate. She adjusted the veil resting on Grace's shoulders as though fixing a display in an expensive store instead of comforting her daughter. "It's time," she said quietly. Grace swallowed hard. "Mom, I can't do this." Eleanor's expression barely changed. "You can, and you will. You never asked what I wanted. Want has nothing to do with survival." Grace felt tears gathering despite every promise she had made to herself. "I don't even know him." Eleanor stepped closer until their reflections merged inside the mirror. "You know enough. He's a widower. He has a little boy. He agreed to the arrangement. That should be enough." Grace looked away. "Everyone says he's just a struggling black single father." Eleanor sighed impatiently before leaning close enough that only Grace could hear her next words. "Then consider yourself fortunate. He may be black, but his money can save us." The sentence landed with a weight that seemed to silence even the music outside. Grace stared at her mother, shocked less by the words than by how casually they had been spoken. Before she could answer, another sound drifted through the slightly open doorway. Small footsteps, then the quiet laugh of a child. Grace instinctively turned toward the hallway, just as a little boy, no older than 6, carefully straightened the tie of the tall man standing beside him. The man knelt without hesitation, smiling warmly as he buttoned the child's navy blazer and brushed invisible dust from his tiny shoulders. His suit was simple. His watch looked ordinary. Nothing about him suggested wealth. Everything about him suggested patience. "Ready, buddy?" he asked gently. The little boy nodded with complete trust before slipping his hand into the man's larger one. Neither of them realized someone inside the bridal suite was watching. Neither of them noticed that the words spoken only seconds earlier had reached the hallway before the door had fully closed. Marcus Reed paused almost imperceptibly. His eyes lifted toward the polished oak door. The warmth in his face never disappeared, but something quieter settled behind it, something that looked remarkably like disappointment. Then, without saying a single word, he looked back down at his son and smiled again. "Come on, Noah," he whispered. "Let's go meet the future." The chapel doors opened slowly, and the afternoon sunlight spilled across the polished stone aisle in long ribbons of gold. More than 300 guests turned together, conversations dissolving into silence as Grace Whitmore stepped inside on her father Richard Whitmore's arm. Every camera lifted. Every smile looked rehearsed. Every handshake waiting outside this ceremony represented another business agreement her family desperately needed. Grace could feel the weight of those expectations more heavily than the delicate veil resting across her shoulders. She kept her eyes lowered until the music softened and the figure waiting near the altar came into focus. Marcus Reed stood perfectly still with Noah beside him. The little boy wore a tiny navy suit with white sneakers that looked almost too new, as though he had insisted on keeping them spotless for this one important day. Noah looked up at his father with complete admiration, and Marcus answered with a reassuring smile that reached his eyes. Grace had expected someone hardened by disappointment, someone bitter after years of struggle. Instead, she saw a man whose calm presence seemed untouched by the whispers filling the chapel. She could almost hear them floating through the room. She deserves someone better. Poor guy. He is probably terrified marrying into the Whitmore family. At least the boy will have a comfortable life now. None of them knew Marcus had overheard Eleanor's words only minutes earlier. None of them noticed that he never reacted to a single comment. His attention remained on Noah, who quietly squeezed his father's hand before letting go with remarkable courage for a child his age. Grace reached the altar, and for the first time their eyes met without distance between them. Marcus offered a polite nod instead of the confident smile she expected. There was kindness in his expression, but also restraint, as though he had built careful walls around emotions he refused to display in public. "Thank you for being here," he said softly. His voice carried no resentment, no sarcasm, only quiet sincerity. Grace found herself unable to answer immediately. After everything she had been told, after every assumption she had accepted without question, that simple sentence unsettled her more than anger ever could. Before the officiant could begin, Noah tugged gently on his father's sleeve. "Dad," he whispered. Miss Grace looked sad. Marcus bent slightly until he was eye level with his son. "Sometimes people carry burdens we cannot see," he replied. "The best thing we can do is treat them with kindness." Noah nodded thoughtfully before looking toward Grace with an innocent smile that held no judgment whatsoever. Something tightened inside her chest. No one in her own family had asked whether she was frightened today. No one had wondered if she was ready. Yet this little boy, standing in polished shoes beside a man everyone underestimated, had noticed her sadness within seconds. Grace slowly lifted her eyes toward Marcus again. For a brief moment, the crowded chapel disappeared. The investors, the reporters, the relatives, even the orchestra faded into the background until all she could hear was the quiet rhythm of her own heartbeat. She realized she knew almost nothing about the man standing across from her. But one thing had already become impossible to ignore. Whatever people believed about Marcus Reed, kindness seemed to come as naturally to him as breathing. The ceremony continued beneath towering stained glass windows that scattered blue and amber light across the chapel floor. But Grace barely heard the officiant's words. Every promise sounded distant, drowned beneath the steady rhythm of her own thoughts. She had expected awkwardness, resentment, perhaps even quiet bitterness from the man standing beside her. Instead, Marcus answered each question with calm confidence, never once raising his voice, never once looking toward the rows of influential guests who continued studying him with carefully disguised curiosity. When the ceremony concluded, polite applause filled the room, followed by the familiar flashes of camera lights. Reporters waited near the entrance while investors surrounded Richard and Eleanor Whitmore with congratulatory smiles that felt more strategic than sincere. Grace instinctively stepped back from the crowd, grateful for a moment to breathe. Across the marble foyer, Noah stood beside a table decorated with crystal vases filled with white lilies. His curious eyes wandered across the enormous ballroom beyond the open doors until he noticed an elderly hotel employee struggling to gather a stack of folded chairs. Before anyone could say a word, the little boy hurried across the room and began carrying one lightweight chair at a time with determined concentration. Marcus followed him without hesitation, gently taking the heavier chairs while thanking the employee as though helping was the most natural decision in the world. Several guests watched with puzzled expressions. One executive quietly laughed. "That explains everything," he murmured to another businessman, a working man trying to impress the wealthy crowd. Neither Marcus nor Noah reacted. They simply finished arranging the chairs before returning them to the employee with warm smiles. Grace found herself watching the scene longer than she intended. Her father had spent decades teaching her that powerful people expected to be served, not to serve. Yet Marcus behaved as though no task was beneath him. A few minutes later, the reception began inside the grand ballroom. Crystal chandeliers reflected across polished floors while a jazz quartet played softly beneath ceilings nearly 40 feet high. Uniformed servers moved gracefully between tables carrying silver trays filled with sparkling cider and carefully prepared appetizers. Grace noticed one young server stumble slightly after another guest accidentally brushed past him. Several glasses tilted dangerously. Before they could fall, Marcus reached forward, steadying the tray with one hand while placing a reassuring hand on the young man's shoulder. "You are all right," he said with an easy smile. "Take a breath." Nobody was hurt. The young server thanked him repeatedly, relief washing across his face. Grace watched several wealthy guests exchange amused looks, almost offended that the groom had interrupted conversations to help someone wearing a service uniform. Eleanor noticed as well. She leaned toward Grace without taking her eyes off Marcus. "You see the problem?" she whispered. "He still thinks like someone who belongs on the other side of the room." Grace looked from her mother to Marcus. He was kneeling beside Noah now, carefully straightening the little boy's crooked bow tie before quietly reminding him to thank every person who greeted them. Noah nodded seriously before walking to an elderly woman seated alone near the window and introducing himself with remarkable confidence. The woman laughed warmly as the child spoke, her lonely expression softening almost. Immediately, Grace could not explain why the simple moment stayed with her. The ballroom overflowed with successful people discussing mergers, investments, and political connections, yet the only genuine kindness she had witnessed all afternoon had come from the father and son everyone seemed determined to underestimate. As the afternoon sunlight faded beyond the ballroom windows, the reception settled into the polished rhythm expected from one of the most influential families in the state. Crystal glasses chimed softly. Conversations about investments drifted from table to table. Every smile appeared carefully practiced. Grace remained beside Marcus for photographs, yet an invisible distance still separated them. She noticed he never tried to stand closer than necessary, almost as though he respected a boundary she had never asked him to keep. Across the room, Noah wandered carefully between guests, fascinated by the towering floral arrangements that nearly reached the chandeliers. His small hand stayed folded behind his back exactly as Marcus had taught him. "Look with your eyes before your hands," Grace had overheard him say earlier. Noah smiled politely at everyone who greeted him until a burst of laughter caught his attention. Near the center of the ballroom, several children belonging to wealthy guests had gathered around the display table where the wedding rings had rested before the ceremony. Noah stepped closer, hoping to join them. One boy glanced at Noah's sneakers and quietly whispered something that made the others laugh. Another child shrugged and said, "My dad says your dad only got invited because he needed help." Noah's smile faded. He looked down at the polished floor instead of answering. Grace witnessed the exchange from several feet away. Before she could move, Marcus was already beside his son. He did not question the children. He did not look toward their parents. Instead, he knelt until he and Noah were face to face. "What happened, buddy?" he asked gently. Noah hesitated before speaking in a voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe they do not want me here." Marcus smiled with the same calm expression Grace had seen all day. He carefully brushed a wrinkle from Noah's jacket before answering. "Listen to me. A room does not decide your value. Expensive clothes do not decide your value. Other people's opinions do not decide your value. Character does." Noah blinked as Marcus continued. "You never need permission to be kind. You never need permission to show respect. If someone cannot see your heart today, maybe tomorrow they will." The little boy nodded slowly. "Should I be angry?" Marcus shook his head. "No. Being kind is not the same as being weak. We leave every place better than we found it. That is who we are." Noah reached for his father's hand, and together they quietly walked toward a nearby refreshment table without another word. The children who had laughed moments earlier watched in complete silence. Grace remained frozen where she stood. Those simple sentences echoed inside her mind far louder than the music filling the ballroom. She remembered every formal dinner her parents had hosted throughout her childhood, every lesson about status, reputation, and influence. Not once had anyone explained dignity the way Marcus had in less than a minute. Eleanor approached with a composed smile that never reached her eyes. "There you are," she said to Grace. "Several board members are asking to meet your husband." Grace looked toward Marcus, who was helping Noah carry 2 small dessert plates for an elderly couple seated alone by the windows. "He seems busy," Grace replied quietly. Eleanor followed her gaze and sighed. "That is exactly what worries me." Grace did not answer. For the first time since the wedding had begun, she wondered whether the richest person in the ballroom might not be measured by money at all. The reception slowly shifted from elegant celebration into carefully arranged conversations where every compliment carried another hidden intention. Investors gathered around Richard Whitmore discussing market forecasts while photographers moved quietly from table to table capturing polished smiles that looked identical from every angle. Grace noticed Marcus had slipped away from the center of attention without announcing it. She found him outside on the stone terrace overlooking a peaceful lake where the evening breeze carried the scent of pine trees and fresh rain from distant hills. Noah stood beside the railing watching ducks glide across the water, completely unaware of the expensive conversations happening behind the ballroom walls. Grace hesitated before stepping outside. "You disappeared," she said softly. Marcus smiled politely. Noah needed a little fresh air. So did I. Before either of them could continue, the terrace doors opened again. Eleanor Whitmore emerged with two influential donors following several steps behind. She stopped the moment she saw Marcus standing with Grace. "There you are," she said with a practiced smile. "Some of our guests have been asking questions." Marcus remained calm. "I will answer whatever I can." Eleanor folded her hands neatly. "Actually, I think it would be better if you simply listened tonight. These people are accustomed to a certain level of sophistication." Grace immediately recognized the warning hidden beneath her mother's carefully chosen words. Marcus did not react. "I understand," he answered quietly. Eleanor continued as though explaining obvious facts to a child. "Business leaders notice everything. The way someone speaks, the way they dress, the people they spend time with. First impressions matter." Noah looked up at his father, sensing the uncomfortable silence even if he did not fully understand it. Marcus gently rested one hand on the boy's shoulder. "Thank you for your advice," he said. "I always appreciate honesty." Eleanor offered a satisfied nod before turning back toward the ballroom. As she walked away, one of the donors glanced at Marcus and remarked just loudly enough to be heard, "At least he knows his place." Their footsteps faded into the music inside. The terrace became quiet except for the distant sound of water touching the shore. Grace felt heat rise across her face. "I am sorry," she whispered. "You should not have heard that." Marcus watched the lake for several seconds before answering. "People often tell you exactly who they are when they think you have nothing to offer them." His voice held no anger, only calm certainty. Grace lowered her eyes. "I should have said something." Marcus looked at her with surprising gentleness. "Perhaps, but standing up for someone is difficult when you have spent your whole life trying not to disappoint the people you love." The words settled heavily between them because they were true. Grace realized he understood her struggle without asking for an explanation. Just then Noah reached into his pocket and carefully pulled out a slightly crushed white flower that had fallen from one of the wedding arrangements earlier that afternoon. "Miss Grace," he said with a hopeful smile, "I picked this up because I thought nobody should leave a pretty flower on the floor." Grace accepted it carefully, smoothing the bent petals with her fingertips. Something inside her quietly shifted. She looked at the small flower, then at the father who had answered quiet prejudice with dignity instead of resentment, and for the first time she felt ashamed not of the marriage arranged for her, but of her own silence. The reception gradually faded into the quiet glow of evening as the last colors of sunset reflected across the lake beyond the estate. One by one the guests returned inside for speeches and music, leaving the garden pathways almost empty. Grace slipped away without telling anyone, still holding the slightly crushed white flower Noah had given her. She followed a narrow stone path lined with lanterns until she reached a small wooden bench overlooking the water. The breeze carried the scent of cedar and fresh grass, and for the first time that day there was no applause, no conversation about business, no cameras searching for perfect photographs. Only silence. She sat down carefully, smoothing the folds of her wedding gown across the bench, and stared at the flower resting in her palm. It was imperfect, its petals bent from being stepped on, yet Noah had believed it was still worth saving. The thought lingered in her mind longer than she expected. Footsteps approached softly over the gravel path. Marcus stopped several feet away instead of sitting beside her immediately. "May I?" he asked. Grace nodded, and he took the opposite end of the bench, leaving a respectful distance between them. Neither spoke for several moments. The lake rippled gently beneath the fading light, while a pair of ducks drifted across the water without disturbing its still surface. Finally, Grace broke the silence. "Why did you agree to this marriage?" Marcus watched the horizon before answering. "Because Noah deserves stability. He has already lost more than a child should." His voice remained calm, but Grace noticed the quiet sadness behind it. After my wife passed away, people stopped seeing me as a father first. They saw a problem to solve, someone to pity, someone they assumed could not give a child the life he deserved. I learned very quickly that kindness does not always receive kindness in return. Grace lowered her eyes. I am sorry. Marcus smiled gently. You have apologized several times today for things you did not say. She looked toward him. Maybe that is worse. The evening breeze lifted the edge of her veil before settling again. I heard what my mother said before the ceremony, Marcus admitted quietly. Grace felt her heart sink. I wanted to tell you I was ashamed. Marcus shook his head slowly. Do not carry someone else's words as though they belong to you. We all choose what kind of person we become. Grace held the flower more tightly. I have spent my whole life trying to become the daughter everyone expected. Somewhere along the way, I forgot to become myself. Marcus looked toward the ballroom, where laughter echoed faintly through the open doors. That is not something you have to solve tonight. Another silence settled between them, but this one felt different. It was no longer uncomfortable. It felt peaceful, almost healing. A few moments later, Noah came running down the path, slowing as soon as he reached the bench. He climbed onto the space between them with the effortless trust only children possess. Dad? He said softly, pointing toward the first stars appearing above the trees. Mom used to say stars come out when people remember to be good. Marcus looked upward with a quiet smile. She did say that. Noah turned toward Grace. Do you think she can see us? Grace hesitated before answering. I think people who loved us never really stop hoping. For us. Noah smiled, satisfied with the answer, and leaned gently against his father's shoulder. Grace watched them together beneath the growing night sky, and for the first time since the wedding began, the future no longer felt like a prison. It felt uncertain, quiet, and perhaps, if she found enough courage, capable of becoming something entirely different. The peaceful evening ended when the distant sound of approaching engines rolled through the estate. At first, Grace assumed more guests had arrived late, but the conversations inside the ballroom gradually stopped as one luxury sedan after another entered the circular driveway beyond the tall front windows. Valets who had spent the entire afternoon greeting wealthy executives suddenly straightened their posture. Hotel managers hurried toward the entrance. Even the musicians lowered their instruments as an unfamiliar silence settled over the reception. Grace exchanged a puzzled glance with Marcus, who showed no sign of surprise. Noah looked up at his father. Are they here already? He asked quietly. Marcus smiled gently. Looks like they are. Before Grace could ask what he meant, the ballroom doors opened. Nearly a dozen men and women dressed in tailored business attire walked inside with calm precision. They were not family members. They were not politicians. Yet the confidence in their steps caused conversations throughout the room to disappear. At their center was an older woman carrying a slim leather portfolio embossed with a silver crest. She scanned the room briefly before walking directly toward Marcus. Without hesitation, she extended both hands respectfully. Good evening, Mr. Reed, she said warmly. Congratulations on your marriage. I apologize for arriving during the reception, but the board meeting overseas concluded earlier than expected. Grace blinked. The room became so quiet that the soft music from outside drifted through the open terrace doors. Eleanor Whitmore frowned slightly. Excuse me, she interrupted. I believe there has been some misunderstanding. The woman turned politely. No misunderstanding, ma'am. She looked back toward Marcus. The directors from New York, London, Tokyo, and Dubai asked me to personally deliver the finalized documents. They also asked me to congratulate our chairman. Chairman. The single word spread through the ballroom like a ripple across still water. Richard Whitmore slowly lowered the glass in his hand. Several investors stared at Marcus before quickly looking toward one another as though silently confirming what they had just heard. Grace watched the confusion unfold without understanding any of it. Marcus accepted the leather portfolio with quiet gratitude. Thank you, Evelyn. I appreciate everyone making the trip. Evelyn smiled. They insisted. After all, the annual meeting cannot officially begin until the founder signs the expansion agreement. One executive near the front whispered under his breath, Founder. Another answered with visible disbelief. Reed Global Holdings. The first man's eyes widened. That Reed. Grace felt the words echo inside her mind. Reed Global Holdings. Every major business publication in America had written about the company. It owned transportation networks, renewable energy projects, hospitals, farmland, technology firms, and charitable foundations across the country. Financial analysts often described its founder as one of the wealthiest private citizens in the nation, yet almost nobody had ever seen him publicly. Eleanor took one uncertain step forward. "Surely you do not mean?" Evelyn answered gently before she could finish. "Yes, ma'am. Mr. Marcus Reed founded the company 21 years ago. He continues to serve as executive chairman." The silence became almost overwhelming. Grace slowly turned toward the man she had married only hours earlier. The same simple suit, the same ordinary watch, the same calm smile. Nothing about him had changed. Only her understanding of him had. Marcus looked at Grace with the same kindness he had shown since the beginning of the day. "I was hoping we would have a chance to know each other before any of this became important," he said softly. Unfortunately, life had different plans. No one laughed. No one whispered anymore. The assumptions that had filled the ballroom all afternoon had disappeared, leaving only quiet disbelief where certainty had once stood. No one moved for several long seconds. The ballroom that had been filled with confident conversations now felt almost weightless beneath the silence. Crystal chandeliers continued to sparkle overhead, but every eye remained fixed on Marcus. The same guests who had quietly judged his appearance only an hour earlier now searched his face as though hoping to recognize the businessman they had spent years reading about in financial magazines. Grace slowly looked around the room. She recognized the expressions immediately. Surprise, embarrassment, regret. But none of those emotions affected Marcus. He simply thanked Evelyn for bringing the documents and asked one of the hotel employees to make sure her team had something warm to eat after their flight. Even now, with the entire room realizing who he truly was, his first concern was someone else's comfort. Grace felt another quiet shift inside her heart. It had never been about wealth. It had always been about character. Eleanor finally stepped forward, forcing a gracious smile that appeared far less convincing than before. "Mr. Reed," she began carefully, "I believe we may have misunderstood one another earlier today." Marcus met her eyes with calm respect. "Perhaps we did." She hesitated before continuing. "If anything I said sounded insensitive, I hope you will accept my apology." Marcus nodded politely, but he did not rush to erase the uncomfortable truth. "I appreciate your words, Mrs. Whitmore. We all make assumptions. What matters is what we choose after discovering we were wrong." His answer carried no accusation, only quiet honesty. Richard Whitmore slowly removed his reading glasses and looked down for a moment before speaking. "I built my company believing success meant surrounding myself with powerful people," he admitted. "Today I realized I failed to recognize real strength standing directly in front of me." Marcus offered him the same respectful expression he had given everyone else. Real strength belongs to anyone willing to keep treating people with dignity when they receive none in return. Grace could no longer remain silent. She stepped toward Marcus until they stood only a few inches apart. The ballroom disappeared from her thoughts. The cameras, the investors, the business leaders no longer mattered. She looked directly into his eyes. "I owe you an apology too," she said quietly. "Not because I believed you were poor. I am ashamed because I never questioned why that should have mattered. I heard people judge you. I heard words that should never have been spoken, and I stayed silent." Marcus listened without interrupting. Grace glanced toward Noah, who stood holding Evelyn's hand while looking curiously at the adults. "The first person I should have protected today was not myself," Grace continued. "It was your son. Children should never feel like they have to earn respect." Marcus followed her gaze toward Noah. A gentle smile crossed his face. "He will remember kindness longer than he remembers unkindness. That is what I have always hoped to teach him." Grace felt tears gathering, but this time they came without fear. "I cannot change how today began," she whispered. "But if you are willing, I want to become someone worthy of standing beside both of you." Marcus remained silent for a brief moment before extending his hand toward her, not as a billionaire offering forgiveness, but as a man offering trust one careful step at a time. Grace accepted his hand without hesitation. Nearby, Noah smiled so brightly that even several guests who had spent the afternoon whispering lowered their eyes in quiet reflection. In that moment, the grand ballroom no longer felt like a place where status determined value. It felt like a place where humility had quietly accomplished what wealth never could. The reception ended long after midnight, but no one remembered the expensive decorations or the famous guests when they spoke about that wedding in the years that followed. They remembered the silence that settled over the ballroom after the truth became known. They remembered a little boy who smiled at strangers before they smiled at him. They remembered a man who never demanded respect, yet somehow inspired it in everyone willing to look beyond appearances. Months passed, and the headlines that once focused on mergers and fortunes slowly gave way to another story entirely. Grace Whitmore Reed quietly stepped away from the social circles that had shaped her childhood. Instead of attending endless charity galas designed for photographs, she began visiting the children's education centers funded by the Reed Foundation. She spent afternoons reading with students, listening to families, and learning names instead of titles. The work changed her more than any speech ever could. Marcus never asked her to become someone different. He simply welcomed every sincere step she chose to take. No one noticed the change before anyone else. One Saturday morning he ran through the gardens outside their home, carrying a drawing folded carefully in both hands. He climbed onto the porch where Marcus and Grace were sharing coffee beneath the rising sun. "I made something," he announced proudly. Marcus unfolded the paper. 3 stick figures stood beneath a bright yellow sky. One was tall. One wore a long dress. The smallest held both of their hands. Above them Noah had written in uneven letters, "My family." Grace smiled as tears quietly filled her eyes. "It is beautiful," she whispered. Noah grinned. "Because now it is true." Marcus looked from the drawing to Grace. Nothing needed to be explained. Some promises were spoken without words. Later that afternoon, Grace visited her parents. The Whitmore estate looked exactly the same, but the conversation inside felt entirely different. Eleanor admitted she had spent years measuring people by accomplishments instead of character. Richard quietly confessed that losing nearly everything had taught him how little wealth could accomplish without integrity. Grace listened without judgment. Before leaving, she embraced both of them. Forgiveness did not erase the past, but it opened a door the past could never unlock by itself. As the seasons changed, Marcus continued leading one of the largest companies in the country with the same quiet discipline he had shown long before anyone recognized his name. Employees often remarked that he knew custodians, receptionists, interns, and executives by name. Visitors noticed there were no reserved elevators for senior leadership. New managers quickly learned that kindness toward every employee mattered just as much as quarterly results. Grace finally understood why success had followed him for so many years. It had never begun with money. It had begun with respect. One quiet evening, nearly a year after the wedding, the 3 of them returned to the same lake behind the estate where Grace had once sat holding a single crushed white flower. The water reflected the colors of another peaceful sunset, while a gentle breeze carried the scent of pine across the shoreline. Noah skipped small stones across the surface, laughing each time one bounced farther than the last. Marcus slipped his hand into Grace's, and this time there was no hesitation between them. They watched the fading light together without speaking. Some endings arrive with applause. Others arrive with silence gentle enough to let the truth be heard. In that quiet moment, Grace finally understood that the greatest fortune she had ever received was never measured in dollars. It was measured in the kindness of a man who chose dignity over pride, in the trust of a little boy who offered love before certainty, and in the courage to see another human being not for the color of his skin or the size of his fortune, but for the goodness of his heart.